Welcome to Revolution Weekly, where we dive into the details of our many periodic revolutions, elections. I'm your host Alvin, and today we're going to be talking about the 2020 US elections. So, about a few weeks ago, as you all may know, Joe Biden has finally been inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States. Now, of course, before that had happened, we had all the drama in Capitol Hill, and of course, the 2020 election, and just because of just how weird 2020 has been, we would like to forget all that has happened. But today I'm gonna be here to run you through everything and to just tell you basically what happened and what happened before that and just kind of what might happen likely in the future as a result of what has happened recently. So the way I've decided to do this first episode of mine is to divide it into three different parts. So in the first part, we're going to be talking about the primary season, which is, as you remember, started way back early last year. Of course, the Republican primary was basically non-existent. So we're going to be focusing mostly on the Democratic primary. And then we're going to be talking about, of course, the second part, the election itself, the Joe Biden, Donald Trump election. And, then use a third part to just kind of talk about what has happened since that particular election, the Georgia runoff election, the Capitol insurrection, things like that. And, and the sort of electoral implications that might have going forward. Now, I've actually recorded an episode earlier than this, going up to the election season. But I'm so glad that I've decided to record this much later because, a lot of the things that have happened since that particular election has been really interesting. And, and without the hindsight, I think, I might have not been able to go into the topic as much. So anyways, let's just start with our first episode ever and the first part of this three-part series on the 2020 election about the primary. We're going to start this episode about the primaries. So basically what happened and what are primaries? So, as you may know, the US currently runs on a two-party system. So you have Democrats and Republicans. And of course, to choose the presidential candidate, you kind of have to have an election within the party. It's basically an election before the actual election itself, which is the actual national election between the two parties. So, initially, way back when, I didn't really pay much attention to these primary elections. And of course, I'm pretty sure most of the world doesn't really know about these elections anyway. So don't worry, I'll be holding your hand through all of this. Just so, because when it was happening, I learned a lot as well. And so hopefully you can learn a lot from this too. So, it's like I said, the Republican primaries basically non-existent. And this is the presidential primary, by the way. So, of course, as you know, Donald Trump is the candidate for president in this particular election season. And that's how it's always been, right? It's if you're incumbent in the office, it's almost never happens where, you actually get kicked out, right? In favor of another candidate to come in in the middle of your term. It just never happens. So of course, Donald Trump would automatically went through what primary procedures there were, where people voted for who they would like to be their presidential candidate. And of course, Donald Trump won every single state, hands down. There was a couple of candidates who tried to run against Donald Trump. And of course, none of them got any attention. And of course, that's why, we don't really talk about them. But anyways, now we get to the really exciting primary, the Democratic primary. Now, the Democratic primary, this particular election cycle, it was interesting to me because, this is the first one that I've actually paid attention to. And it's the first one, and it's the one with the most candidates, actually. It's in the history of, Democratic primaries, this is the one with the most candidates. There was over 20 candidates to start. So, you kind of have your big names, of course, Joe Biden, obviously. So then, and you also have, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, who's now vice president, funny story. And, it's Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar. It's and unless, you're really into it, you probably wouldn't even know some of these names, Beto O'Rourke. And you have more obscure people as well. And the list goes on and on. But anyways, so, we have all of these players coming in, and of course, initially, I think it's the field was so big that I think it's in the first few debates they kind of had to do this weird thing where they divided the candidates equally, and kind of like made them debate in 2 different nights. Now, of course, like I said, this has never happened before, so it's certainly interesting to see, it's like the kind of combinations that ended up happening in these debates, where it's like, oh, you can see, oh, Bernie Sanders is going to go against Joe Biden this night, or it's like, oh, all of like the people who are polling really high were all going to go in one night, and then the other night it was just going to be like, the first debate I think was like Elizabeth Warren going against everybody else who was like polling less than 1%. So I think it's like that was like initially very interesting to watch. And this is like, no, actually, like I said this started early 2020. No, I actually take that back. This actually started in the middle of 2019. I remember actually. Yeah, no, so I think it's like that was like initially, it was just like a crowded field. And it's like, although, we all kind of knew, it's like who would be like 5 or 6 who are actually like, like relevant, like prominent, like candidates who actually had a chance. Of course, but it was still interesting nevertheless to see a whole bunch of like new faces, old faces, people, just kind of like duking it out basically. And I think it's like, it kind of also speaks to like the wider, party divide that you've been seeing since arguably 2016, where it's like, in the Democratic Party, where it's like between progressives and, like establishment Democrats. So it's like, you kind of course, Joe Biden, is like, would be like an establishment Democrat, and Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren would be like a progressive Democrat. So I think it's like that, I think, was like, besides, like the squabble of like 20 different people talking about whatever they talk about, trying to get attention. It's like the other big battle was that basically it was like for like the soul of the party, as it were. It's like, it's like who was actually gonna like, like take over the party? Are we actually finally gonna see a progressive takeover in Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, or are we gonna see reinstatement or like a strengthening of the status quo in Joe Biden? Now, of course, being that Joe Biden is president now, you would say, oh yeah, we kind of already knew what happened there, but how we got there is really interesting. So I think that's why I'd like to really dive more into like this, idea of like primaries. So yeah, like I said, it was like late 2019, and you kind of had a couple of debates where it's like, candidates were just throwing things around. But I think it's like ultimately, yeah, like I said, it was like this big battle between progressives and establishment Democrats. And I think that was like, watching the debates, that was like the big ideas that were being thrown around. Should we have Medicare for all? Should we legalize drugs? Should we do criminal justice reform? Things like that, $15 minimum wage. Interestingly, I think it's like, which one of those few things that like what Joe Biden is for, So I think it's like you kind of like from the dynamics of these first few debates, you could actually really see that progressive ideas are actually gaining traction within the party. So much so that like a lot of candidates actually, interestingly, actually started out very progressive. But I think it's like over time, as they realized that the progressive lane has like kind of like been taken up by, of course, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they've kind of had to had to like backtrack the progressive messaging, because that's not where the money is. The money is, of course, with corporate interest, and corporate interest supports establishment Democrats. So you candidates like Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, Pete Buttigieg were initially out the door. They were very progressive. And I think like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg in particular was interesting in a sense that initially they actually supported Medicare for all. They actually supported all of like these progressive measures, but in the last minute, so like eventually they kind of started backing out of it. And things like around the same time, you could actually see that they're starting to see like an uptick in like corporate donations and corporate money, and of course like a very different like messaging. So of course like Pete Buttigieg, for example, started out saying, oh yeah, let's do Medicare for all, but like eventually he kind of like angled to like this other messaging, which is let's do Medicare for all who want it, which is basically a public option, which which is also like what Joe Biden is for. That's the other thing. I think it's like it's like you kind of had, I would say, hypocrites basically. So you kind of had those kinds of candidates, but then you also have candidates like Joe Biden who who of course is very establishment, is as establishment as they come. But I think it's like seeing the winds of political change. You could really see him like starting to embrace some of these progressive ideas, $15 minimum wage. I think like a public option and things like that. Now, see, of course, it's really interesting because now that he's in there, it's like now some people are like actually looking back into like these old debates, and like they're seeing it's like, oh, like you said you weren't for these things, but like we want it, like where are you going to live with it or not? No, I think it's more likely that he wouldn't. And if he doesn't, that means it was purely messaging. It was purely signaling to people. It was like it wasn't. He was conceding in like rhetorically, but he wasn't actually conceding in any meaningful way. So of course, you could like look at this and say, oh, like the corporate Democrats, like the establishment Democrats, ultimately, kind of like won out, So and that the progressives actually don't really have a platform per se. But I think it's like on the other hand, you could say, oh, it's like because the fact that he had to change his messaging, the fact that he had to pander the progressives somehow showed that maybe they actually do have some power in the party. But anyways, so we have these debates, So then we get to Iowa. So it's just like we get to primary season, which is like most Iowa being the first state is always like the one that everyone's always like watching, everyone's always eagerly campaigning in. So it's like Iowa in any other context in American life, culture, politics is irrelevant. But in this particular instance, in the instance of primaries, both Democrat and Republican, Iowa is significant because it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the election. But anyways, so Republican primary, nothing to talk about there. Donald Trump swept it. Democratic primary, now this is like where it gets interesting because I think initially I think it's like throughout the whole election cycle, right before the primaries, Joe Biden has been polling consistently high, and I think that's because it was like if you say Joe Biden, would you want him as president? Most people would be like, who's Joe Biden? But if you say Obama's vice president, and you're like, oh, I liked Obama, so I should like Joe Biden too. So I think because of that, like initially Joe Biden's polling was very high. It was very nice. It was very good. And in terms of second place, you kind of like see Elizabeth Warren come up sometimes. You kind of see Kamala Harris, who came up really far at one point too. But I think it's like consistently, the most consistent, it's always been Bernie Sanders. That's always head to head with Joe Biden. So it's like Bernie's always second and Joe Biden's always first. So that's the dynamic, right? Oh, that's always been the most consistent dynamic right before we get into Iowa. Now, once we do get into Iowa, it's interesting because the results tell a completely different story. So, in terms of popular vote, Bernie won the primary in that state. But because it's a caucus system, technically, Pete Buttigieg ended up walking out with more delegates than Bernie Sanders. So, basically, in case you don't know, it's like a caucus is basically, instead of like a purely popular vote election, really popular vote primary, where, you just kind of like put your favorite candidate in a box, they count it out, that's the guy who won. And they divide the delegates accordingly. No, it's like, so in a caucus situation, each kind of county or each like district, each electoral district, I think, basically does this thing where like, they all try to reach a consensus. So, initially they would ask the whole room, oh, hey, which candidate do you like? And then they would kind of like try to shrink and shrink and shrink. So it's like the candidate with the least amount of votes are encouraged to then join the other groups. And they just keep doing this until, they're down to like the fewest candidate possible, basically. Or it's like even like in some cases like one candidate that the whole room can like agree on, one or two, So basically, because of just how that is, Pete Buttigieg ended up winning slightly by a slight margin. But interestingly, I think there was like a big case, and I think it's like it kind of new details unfolded about that a few weeks ago, where it's like they tried doing this thing this year first time, where it's like they tried using like an app. So but things like and like this app, interestingly enough, like received a lot of money from the Pete Buttigieg campaign. So I'm not saying anything, but I think it's like that is cause for suspicion for like a lot of people, and I think and rightly so. Because I think it's like I don't know, at one point in the middle of the day, I think it's like the app just kind of glitched and like everything, the data became all wonky and stuff. And things like and even before all of this was resolved, Pete Buttigieg went out and declared victory, which is again very fishy. Now, so of course, but anyways, so let's just give Iowa to Pete Buttigieg technically, even though Bernie won the popular vote in that case. Now, of course, if you're wondering where Kamala Harris is in all this, Kamala Harris dropped out right before primaries started. So in case you didn't know, Kamala Harris is a senator from California, was a senator from California. So, in order to make sure that she's able to run again as senator of California, she would have to drop out, before the registration deadline. And the registration deadline was before primaries started. So, of course, seeing she probably was walling around 5% in the polls. Seeing that, I think she made the right call to just drop out ultimately. So she did that. So we'll never know how Kamala Harris would have done in a Democratic primary. But anyways, the next state that that we go to is New Hampshire, which is the other state that I went to look at. So I think it's if you're following along right now, there's I'm not going to talk about every single state. So interestingly, this is how the American election cycle works. So you kind of look at Iowa really closely, you look at New Hampshire really closely, you look at Nevada really closely, then you look at South Carolina. So these 4 states are the first ones who are voting, and that's why they're given special attention. Then you have something called Super Tuesday, where about 13 states vote all at the same time, and these are big states. So I think California and Texas definitely in there. I think New York might be in there as well. But anyways, so it's in this one day, 13 states vote, and after that, there's waves and waves of states. 5 states, 6 states at a time keeps voting, and from there, it just kind of peters out, because then eventually we could kind of tell who's winning and who's losing. So going back to New Hampshire, so of course New Hampshire, being in New England, being in the Pacific Northwest, that region of the U.S., New York, and you just go up a couple of states. So that region has always been very progressive historically. So of course, it's no surprise that Bernie ended up winning there. So it's so Bernie, won hands down, and they over there they just had a primary with a popular vote. It's so people just put names in boxes like a normal election. So Bernie won there, and of course it's Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren trailing behind him, and no particular order. Now, interestingly enough, I think it's the first 2 states here, Joe Biden actually did terribly. Joe Biden finished I think it was 4th in Iowa and 5th in New Hampshire. And this was a guy who had been polling the highest throughout the time before the primaries. So the fact that, he's trailing behind is it's interesting to say the least, because this was a guy who we expected to be really competitive, but he just was not at all. So it's sudden everybody was saying, oh, it's it's a DN for Joe Biden, and it's and then because progressives like to say Bernie won the first 2 states, but I think it's and other people will say, oh, Pete Buttigieg won the first one and Bernie won the second one. So okay, but this third win, the Nevada, Bernie Sanders won again, and won in a landslide. Now at this point, a lot of progressives were saying, oh, this is we're seeing a Bernie wave, could Bernie actually do it? Because historically, the candidate that's been able to win, win Iowa, win, New Hampshire, if they can win these first few states, because and bear in mind, these are very different states. So of course, Iowa is, Midwestern, in the middle of the U.S., smack dab, usually votes Republican. Then you have New Hampshire, which is, like I said, Pacific Northwest, very progressive, very liberal. Then you have Nevada, which is swing state, right? So, so a candidate that's able to win all 3 states, Iowa, like I said, arguable, but a candidate that's able to do really well or win in these 3 states, it's you could say, oh, that means they're basically gonna do well all over the country, because you kind of have these 3 kinds of states: swing state, blue states, and red states, basically. So Bernie won Nevada in a landslide, and Nevada, of course, is a swing state, which bodes well for his electoral prospects for 2 people at the time. So then what ended up happening was, of course, Bernie won a landslide in Nevada, and again, Joe Biden was nowhere to be seen. So at that point, people were saying, oh, is this a Bernie wave? Is Bernie Sanders actually going to be the candidate? I think a lot of people in progressive circles were really giddy about it. And I think it's a notable mention. So I think it's in case I know some people, a good amount of people supports Andrew Yang too, but Andrew Yang lost in Iowa. I think he got no delegates in Iowa. So Andrew Yang dropped out right after that. Just a notable mention. But anyways, so Bernie wins Nevada, Bernie wins New Hampshire, Bernie wins the popular vote in Iowa. So of course, at this point, everyone's saying, "Oh, could this be it?" Then comes South Carolina. Now, of course, I think it's like Joe Biden historically has done really well with black voters, interestingly. So it's like so at the end, and of course, South Carolina is a state with a huge black population. Of course, like Nevada has a huge Latino population, and Bernie, on the other hand, does really well with Latinos. So that's probably a big reason why he was able to win Nevada. So it's like South Carolina, huge black population. And at the same time, he got endorsements from like particularly, I think it was Jim Clyburn, just like a black senator from South Carolina. And because I think like that ultimately, I think reassured a lot of moderate black voters to vote for Joe Biden. Now, the moment South Carolina happened, so it's like the dynamics changed completely. Bernie, I think, won second, but Joe Biden won his first state. So it's like so then in that case, then yeah, so all of a sudden Joe Biden's campaign has been reinvigorated. He's just done terribly, fourth place, fifth place, third place in the last few states, in the last 3 states, and like now he won. He finally won a state. And like but since some people at the time, like a lot of progressives were saying, oh, it's okay. Like, this is just like a bump in the road, as it were. But no, it's like this is actually hearkening the things that come, because from this point on, spoiler alert, Joe Biden ended up winning almost every single state. Then comes Super Tuesday, which basically spelled the end of the Bernie wave. So the night before Super Tuesday, I think it was like March 13th or something like that. So like sometime in March. So the night before that, Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, which were candidates who were doing averagely well at that point, of course, Pete, being the one to like win the most delegates in Iowa, they both basically dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden wholeheartedly, just completely just dropped out at the same time and just put their put their support to Joe Biden. Now, if you're wondering why, because it's politics. It's like I think they could stay in the race and risk a Bernie Sanders win and not get anything, or they could stay in the race and just not win, because at this point, obviously, they know they have no chance. But so basically, what happened was basically, yeah, like I said, they dropped out. Like it was like really late at night. They did like an event in Texas, I believe, and they both basically dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden. And then they also got better work out to endorse Joe Biden too. Now, if you're wondering, why, what are they getting out of it? Well, I mean, Pete Buttigieg right now is transportation secretary, and we haven't seen what Amy Klobuchar is going to be, or like if she's going to do anything. So, we'll like hold on to that. But Pete Buttigieg got something out of it. Pete Buttigieg is in Joe Biden's cabinet now, right now, as transportation secretary. So, you could say, he did win out in the end. He did get something in the end. But anyways, so right after that, because the moderate candidates at that point, at that point, there was only like 5 viable candidates left. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Joe Biden. Everybody else, no offense, irrelevant. But anyways, so we have these 5 candidates. 3 moderates and 2 progressives. Now, 2 moderates dropped out and endorsed the 1 moderate, Joe Biden. So now immediately, just like that, the moderate vote has been consolidated into 1 candidate. And at the same time, it's like the media, of course, the media loves, moderate Democrats. The media loves corporate Democrats. So that's why I think like you've always like seen Bernie Sanders being smeared, over, things like most recently, funnily enough, about like his mittens being smeared over anything they can like get their hands on, anything they can write. Whereas Joe Biden has always, received fawning coverage. So, especially particularly, I think what ended up being really important in this particular primary season was the argument of electability. In that, who is the best candidate to beat Donald Trump? Bernie Sanders, if you were to poll everyone in the US, everyone would say, yeah, I love Bernie Sanders, I like his ideas, I like his proposals, but I think he's too radical. Now, of course, it was like, why? And it's like, because he's too radical, I don't think he can beat Donald Trump. Now, of course, multiple polls would say that's not true, but to the average American, to the average Democrat, member to, just to people not really into politics. Yeah, it's like it makes sense, but he's too radical. So, how could you get Republicans to vote for him if he's too radical? So I think that's why ultimately a lot of people managed, like settled for Joe basically. So it's like, oh, I like Bernie, but Joe's better. Or it's like, oh, like the media keeps telling me, Joe's better. Joe's more moderate. Joe's more likely to get right-wing voters. So and so, so and so. So, anyways, Super Tuesday happens. It was like that. Joe Biden won over half of the states. Joe Biden won Texas. Joe Biden won. It was like a good number of states that Joe Biden won. Bernie managed to win California, but by a slimmer margin than what he would have gotten. So at this point, 3 candidates left: Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren. Now, of course, Elizabeth Warren, like her or hate her, she did end up like sucking up a lot of votes from Bernie Sanders. So, so I think like with the progressive votes split and the moderate vote consolidated at the same time with the relentless media campaign paint Joe Biden as the most electable candidate. And just like, because of that, over time, it's like as other states began to vote, yeah, Joe Biden ended up winning every single state. It was just no question. Like the last time Bernie won a state, like the last time Bernie wins a state in this particular primary was during Super Tuesday. Unless you count America Samoa as a state. It was like Bernie won America Samoa, but that's it. But it's like, after that, Joe Biden won every single state. Bernie came in second, mind you, of course, obviously. It was only Elizabeth Warren, I think it's like tried to do this thing where she stabbed Bernie in the back, where it's like she was calling him a sexist or whatever. So, that was interesting. I'm totally uncalled for. And mind you, they were supposed to be best friends. So I think in one of the debates, interestingly enough, I think Bernie actually went down the stage pretty grumpy. And there was actually leaked audio of like them arguing after the debates. Look it up. So that happened. Of course, then because of that, it became even progressive vote became even more fractured. But eventually she dropped out ultimately long after long after it would have made an impact. So, but at that point, Joe Biden was just winning every single state, basically. No question. So then, you suddenly start seeing something called the Biden wave. And, this was like a wave. This was a much bigger wave than the Bernie wave, because the Bernie wave was only winning 3 or 4 states. The Biden wave won everything after Super Tuesday. April, think primaries in April, May, like June. He just won everything. And of course, the progressives at this point was just like, it was horrible in a sense where it's like, it's like everyone came in. I think it's like, and I do sympathize with progressives, of course. And it's like, in case you can't tell, but it's like, it's like everyone came in with like the optimism. It's like, oh, are we actually going to get President Bernie Sanders? Because of course, like 2 progressives, obviously Bernie Sanders is going to beat Trump. Obviously Bernie Sanders is better than Trump. But, as April, May, and June rolled on, like people, as more and more, it's like people endorsed Joe Biden, like people who dropped out initially and stuff like that, eventually it just became a bloodbath basically. And like by the time, June rolls on, like the actual Democratic National Convention where they actually confirm the presidential candidate, yeah, it's like at this point, there was just no chance. At this point, the talk was more about how Bernie can get concessions. And of course, as you know, Bernie ultimately dropped out and endorsed Joe Biden. Now, of course, like what he got out of it, initially, it's like it didn't seem like he got anything out of it. And I think it's like that made a lot of people really angry. But, things like with Bernie dropping out, I think, of course, now, he's chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, which is, in case you don't know, is a very important position. And we're going to talk more about that in part 3. But anyways, so like by that point, after Bernie dropped out and there was a few states left voting, that was basically it. Primary season was basically over at that point. And that, yeah, it's like, in a sense, it was like Joe Biden is the candidate. And now the question becomes what Bernie got out of it, if he got anything out of it, and, and who Joe Biden's going to pick for his vice president. Now, of course, because of COVID, like the convention ended up being, it initially was supposed to be like an in-person event, ended up being a digital event. But anyways, not the sidetrack or anything, but like, yeah, but basically Joe Biden ended up being the candidate. Eventually he revealed that Kamala Harris was his vice president. Funny enough, that actually got leaked before it was like meant to be revealed. But yeah, anyways, there you have it. So basically, Joe Biden at that point was the candidate. Kamala Harris was like his vice presidential candidate, and then they were gonna go up against Donald Trump, of course, Mike Pence, of course, his vice president, and that's basically how like the 2020 election is set up. And this was like around June, July, where all of this was like kind of like confirmed. All right, in the second part, we're going to be talking about the actual 2020 election, as it were. Kind of the build up, the campaigning. It's like what like the polls were saying initially, the kind of factors that ended up like making it for Joe Biden, and like how like Trump as an incumbent lost. All these kinds of interesting topics. So see you in the second part.